Hi, everyone. All right, let's dive into a topic that really gets at the heart of how we read, interpret, and respond to texts. And I don't just mean books or articles, but all forms of communication, from media and research reports to social media posts and even classroom materials. I'm talking about critical literacy, and more specifically, how it connects to power relations. So, what is critical literacy? At its core, critical literacy is not just about understanding what's being said, but also about asking deeper questions. Questions like whose voices are included here? Whose voices are missing? What ideologies are being reinforced? What's being challenged? And perhaps, most importantly, why? In other words, critical literacy is about questioning what's being said, who's saying it, and why. It examines inclusion, exclusion, and power. Let's take that first question. Whose voices are included or excluded? This is a powerful starting point because every time we read or listen to something, we are engaging with someone's perspective. And for every perspective included, there is often another that's being left out, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not. Let me give you an example. Imagine you're reading a textbook on world history. It might talk at length about European exploration, what it often calls the Age of Discovery. Now, from a European point of view, this was a time of great adventure, of expanding knowledge, of building empires. But stop for a moment and ask, whose voice is this? Is this how indigenous people in the Americas, Africa, or Asia experienced that period? Was it a discovery for them or an invasion? When critical literacy kicks in, we begin to notice that the text may be privileging a colonial narrative, centering the colonizers, and marginalizing or erasing the voices of the colonized. We start to see that the book is a neutral, is shaped by a particular set of assumptions, a particular worldview. And when those other voices, those of the enslaved, the displaced, the silenced, are missing, we get a distorted picture of history. Now, let's turn to that second question. What ideologies are being reinforced or challenged? Ideologies are basically systems of belief about what's normal, what's valuable, what's right. And they show up in all kinds of texts, often in very subtle ways. Take, for instance, a news article that describes protests. If the article uses words like rioters or violent mobs, it may be framing the protesters as dangerous or irrational. But if it uses terms like activists or demonstrators, it may be suggesting that these are people standing up for justice. Same event, different words, different ideology. A critical reader would step back and ask, what's the writer's stance here? Are they supporting the status quo or are they highlighting resistance? Are they presenting multiple sides or just one dominant perspective? And again, we return to the question of power because ideologies don't just float around in the air. They are backed by institutions, by media, corporations, by governments, by educational systems. And these systems decide which narratives get amplified and which get buried. Think about standardized tests. They often include reading passages and writing prompts that reflect middle class, Western, English speaking norms. A student from a rural village in Bangladesh or a township in South Africa might find the references completely unfamiliar. But the test doesn't acknowledge this. Instead, it evaluates the student's literacy or reading ability as though everyone comes from the same background. This is where we see the connection to power very clearly. The production of knowledge, what gets published, what gets taught, what gets tested, is not a neutral process. is shaped by those who have the resources, the platforms, the authority. And this is exactly why taking a critical stance matters, because when we begin to question the power structures embedded in knowledge production, we start to uncover a whole range of assumptions we might have otherwise taken for granted. For example, let's say a research study claims that boys outperform girls in math in a particular country. A surface level reading might accept this as fact, but a critical reader would dig deeper. They would ask, how was this study designed? Were the cultural expectations around gender considered? Were girls discouraged from speaking up in class? Was the test language biased toward one gender's experiences? Suddenly we realize that what looked like a simple findings is actually entangled with cultural, social, and institutional power dynamics. This kind of critical questioning isn't about being cynical or combative. It's about being awake, about realizing that texts, studies, curricula, and even our casual conversations are never just information dumps. They are always embedded in relationships of power. And when we start to recognize that, we gain the ability to resist manipulation, to advocate for inclusion, and to push by more equitable forms of knowledge. Here is one more scenario. Imagine a university professor who's assigning journal articles for a graduate seminar. All the authors cited are men, are all from the global north. No one in the syllabus comes from the global south or from minoritized groups within the academic world. Again, we ask, whose voices are included? Whose are left out? And what message does that send to students from diverse backgrounds? That knowledge only comes from certain places, from certain people. A critical literacy approach would encourage that professor to rethink the reading list, to actively seek out voices that have been historically marginalized. It would encourage students to challenge what they are taught, not disrespectfully, but thoughtfully, to ask, what's missing? What other stories could be told here? So, to wrap up, critical literacy isn't a skill you check off like a box. It's a mindset, a habit of mind, a way of engaging with the world. It means being attentive to power, to perspective, to inclusion and exclusion. It means realizing that texts do not just inform, they also shape our understanding of what's possible, what's normal, what's right. And once we start reading with those questions in mind, who is speaking, who is silent, what ideologies are at play, we begin to see the world and our place in it with much greater clarity and responsibility. Let's continue this conversation by looking more closely at how these ideas, critical literacy and power relations, play out in applied linguistics and social sciences, because these fields aren't just about language or human behavior in a vacuum. They are deeply connected to politics, culture, and identity, and of course, to power. Take applied linguistics. On the surface, it might look like a technical discipline. We study second language acquisition, language testing, discourse analysis, classroom interactions. But when we ask critical questions, we realize there is a lot more going on. Let's say you are looking at a study on English language proficiency in migrant communities. If the study focuses only on grammatical errors or pronunciation, deficiencies, it might seem like it's helping, but we have to stop and ask, what's the underlying ideology here? Are we treating native speaker English as the gold standard? Are we viewing multilingualism as a problem to fix instead of a resource to celebrate? Think of how often research uses deficit based language. You will see terms like limited proficiency, non native speaker, or language barriers. These terms suggest that the speakers are somehow lacking. But from a critical literacy perspective, we flip the script. We ask, Why do we assume the standard should be a native speaker model of English in the first place? Who decided that? Let's take a real world example, the IELTS or TOEFL exams. These are high stakes tests used for university admission, immigration, and employment. Now, ask yourself, who designs these tests? Whose cultural references do they draw on? Whose version of English do they prioritize? If a test prompt asks a student to write about the advantages of nuclear family structures or to interpret a text about winter sports in Canada, is it fair to someone from a collectivist culture or a tropical country? Here's where power comes in again. These tests may appear neutral, but in fact, they reflect and reinforce certain worldviews, those of the dominant English speaking nations. They reward conformity to that norm and often penalize local expressions or culturally rooted perspectives. Now, let's shift gears and move into social sciences more broadly, fields like sociology, anthropology, psychology, and education. There are fields that claim to explore human experience and society. But again, critical literacy asks us, whose experience? Whose society? Let's say you are reading a psychology paper that analyzes trauma responses among war survivors. Sounds straightforward, but then you notice all the participants are from Western countries, and the measures used are based on Western psychological models. There is no mention of how trauma might be understood differently in, say, indigenous cultures, where healing may involve collective rituals or not just individual therapy. A critical stance would push us to ask, is this research universal, or is it just Western norms dressed up as universal truths? And that has real consequences. Because when these studies inform global mental health policy or NGO interventions, they can impose inappropriate solutions on communities that have very different needs and understandings of well being. In education, it's even more visible. Think of how curriculum policies are shaped. In many former colonies, the language of instruction is still the language of the colonizers: English, French, Portuguese, despite the students speaking other languages at home. When national exams and textbooks ignore local languages and cultures, what's the message to students? That their home language isn't good enough, that knowledge is only legitimate if it comes in a foreign tongue. This reinforces linguistic hierarchies, what some scholars call linguistic imperialism. So, again, the question is, whose language counts and who gets to decide? Another example. Let's talk about discourse analysis. That's a popular area in applied linguistics. Suppose you're analyzing political speeches or classroom interactions. A traditional approach might just look at turn taking, hedging, or cohesion devices. But a critical discourse analyst digs deeper. Who has the power to speak? Who gets interrupted? Whose voice carries authority in the room? Imagine analyzing a faculty meeting at a university. A male professor repeatedly interrupts his female colleagues. The women use more polite language, deferential phrasing. A critical discourse approach would highlight how gendered power dynamics shape not just what is said, but how it is said and received. And this isn't just about gender, it could be class, race, nationality, or academic rank. A junior researcher from the global south might feel pressured to adopt the language and the style of Western academia, even if it erases their lived experiences. This raises big questions. Do we truly value diverse voices, or do we only reward those who conform to elite norms? Let me take you to one more example, this time from the area of language policy. Suppose a government decides that all the schools must teach in English to compete globally. That sounds strategic, right? But if rural students don't have access to qualified English teachers and their families speak another language at home, what happens? These students fall behind, not because they are less intelligent, but because the policy assumes a one size fits all model that privileges urban elite populations. Here, the language policy isn't just about communication, it becomes a gatekeeper. It decides who gets access to higher education, who gets government jobs, who gets to participate in national conversations. That is a textbook case of how power operates through language. So, when we talk about critical literacy, especially in fields like applied linguistics and the social sciences, we are talking about more than reading skills or academic critique. We are talking about social justice. We are talking about the ethics of representation. We are talking about recognizing that knowledge production is not just about facts, it's about whose truths are heard, whose experiences are validated, and whose worldviews are made invisible. Being critically literate means never reading passively. It means constantly asking what's being said, what's not being said, who benefits from this version of the truth, who gets left out. And once we start asking those questions, we don't just become better readers or researchers. We become more responsible, more inclusive, and more empowered participants in the production of knowledge. Next lesson, lesson 10 teaser, contribution to the field. Does the research advance knowledge, offer new insights, or replicate previous work meaningfully? Critical review includes assessing originality, reference, and impact. Thank you very much. Have any questions or comments, please drop them down there and subscribe. Bye.